This is just getting ridiculous. I'm sorry. Again, my apologies. Some sort of technical glitch. I don't know if I hit something or touched something that cut off the first part of this lecture. So I posted um, that first part that then was cut off rather quickly um, as lecture one, part 3A, and then assuming I can get through all of this without a similar problem, this will be part 3B. Hope we can go from there and everything will be okay. And again, my apologies. So I was talking about the Black Death, how it came from the East. Is basically the saliva on fleas on rats. So it's not from rats themselves. The plague, the little bacillus, the virus or the whatever it is that spreads so fiercely, um, spread through the saliva of rats. Rats would get on, or fleas would get on rats and chew on the rats, and the saliva of the fleas chewing on the rats produced this bacillus of the plague. And it ended up being very deadly. In 1347, we have some of the earliest accounts in Italy in the east, and then in Central Europe, it really hits in 1348, and then gets to England in 1349. And I made the analogy to the coronavirus. This was ever so worse than the coronavirus. It's estimated that in aggregate, overall, a third of the population died. A third of the population. If we have around 330 million people in this country, it would be as if 110 million people died of coronavirus. We're not quite to a half a million yet. So just think if when 110 million people died. That's the massive impact that this disease had. And I was talking about the three different types. It's hard to tell. And also it's hard to tell if all the deaths that occurred between 1347 and 1350 were all from the plague. Because it became known pretty quickly that it was contagious. They certainly knew about contagion. So someone in your family would die, and it's okay. Let's take grandma outside and bury her. So we take her outside and bury her. And the next thing I know, I'm sick. So it was known that it was contagious. What to do about it was more problematic. Certainly, quarantining was an idea that began and developed in the plague as a way of mitigating the effects of it. But they did not have the study of epidemiology that we have today. They did not have the CDC or the World Health Organization or Dr. Fauci to tell them exactly what was going on. It was simply people were dying, and in a violent, gross way, and very quickly. The bubonic plague would kill you in a couple days, most likely. A very painful, horrible death. The septicemic and pneumonic could be within a couple of hours. You'd get it and die. It was not nice. And it got so that people were afraid to touch people who would be dead in their house. And so they ended up, instead of burying bodies, just kind of shoving them out onto the streets. So there got to be a lot of dead, plague-infested, rotting bodies in cities, which also causes other diseases and causes of death. Some places, the plague death rates got up to 80% of a city. Just think about it. 80% of a community of a city died from the plague. Other places, not that much at all. Especially in aggregate, approximately a third has been estimated. We don't have firm numbers because the evidence has to be pieced together from a variety of records, and they didn't have very detailed, precise death certificates and things like that we could then make a more secure estimate. So these estimates are estimates, but at least an approximation that gives some indication of the huge impact. And again, I just talked about with the famine in terms of causation. Why was this happening? People were asking, and how humans always have to come up with some kind of an explanation, some kind of a rationale for making sense of it all. Why is this affecting us? There are a couple of different options. One was this must be our enemies. somebody's doing this to us, because this does not happen by nature. Not realizing that it did. But this isn't normal. This is so out of the ordinary. Something is wrong. We're being under attack. Who would want to attack all of Europe? And this was affecting nobles and commoners and peasants and everybody else. Who would want to do that? Well, the Turk, obviously, the Muslims from outside. They haven't infiltrated our society. They didn't know about drones, anything that they could send drones over and drop poison somewhere. It must be somewhere within. Who are the enemies within? The Jews. I talked about the Crusades being one of the first big spikes in anti-Semitism and violence against the Jews, the first ghettos, the first pogroms. Well, in the wake of the Black Death, in the midst of the Black Death and following, we see a huge spike of violence against the Jews. They were said to have, poisoned the wells, because the wells were common to everyone. And this was hitting everybody. Now, it also hit the Jews, too. Jews were dying of plague. We don't have statistics in terms of saying, well, were Jews dying at a lesser rate? We didn't know that. They didn't. We don't know that. They didn't know that. So it doesn't make sense on the one level, because, no, that wasn't happening. And yet, it was an explanation that made sense to them. That was one. But that was only one. And again, the papacy came to the defense of the Jews by and large. The papacy was more like, we don't know what this is happening. It's probably God's scourge. And what to do about that? Because that was the other aspect or rationale for it. This is God's punishment on us. Even if you accepted that view, there's two different responses towards it. One was simply we need to, make supplication, pray, appease God to save us from this calamity and disaster. The other was more, went further in terms of explanation. Why would God be punishing us? Why? Because we are sinful. We have not atoned for our sins. And why haven't we? Well, it's obvious. The priests are not doing their jobs. These damned priests, they've been letting us off easy. There's a whole story behind that I could explain as well, which is a great story, but I'll abbreviate to keep it focused here on the point. They're not absolving us. They're not giving us enough penance. Because how did the issue of confession and absolution work? 3 parts of confession: oral confession, confessio oris, the satisfaction of works for doing penance, and then the absolution and true contrition. So it's oral confession, contrition, and then doing the penance and the absolution. That would lead to absolution. We're not doing sufficient penance. We must then, if the priests are not going to do their jobs, those bastards, we have to take it on ourselves. So we have to give ourselves penance. There were groups that were called the penitents. They would go around whipping themselves. Also known as the flagellants. Not the flatulence, the flagellants, beating oneself. And these were groups of people that felt that the only way to deal with this is to appease God. And the only way we can appease God to call off the plague would be to atone for our sins by doing the penance that we deserve, that the priests have not given us. So what we have here is this sense of the failure of the clergy at large. We cannot rely on them. We thought we could, but look what's happening. They are failing in their duty to us. And this led to rather widespread, I'm not saying general by any means, but more than just an isolated case here and there, which there has always been, of what's called anti-clericalism. What is anti-clericalism? It's being against the clergy, critiquing the clergy. Now, there's various forms of anti-clericalism. As a graduate student, we our program, my advisor, hosted a major international conference on anti-clericalism and published the proceedings of it. It's a big fat volume looking at all the different types of anti-clericalism, meaning critique of the clergy, antagonism over against the clergy, the lack of trust in the clergy to do their jobs. The Pope condemned the flagellants, obviously, because they were criticizing the institutionalized church. They would go from town to town preaching the need to do your own penance, to atone for your sins, because this is divine punishment. And what it led to is an undermining of the trust of the clergy, the clerical establishment, the church, everything from your parish priest all the way up to the Pope. We can't trust these people anymore. That's a problem. So in addition to just the epidemiological problem of the plague, the fact that it kills people, the population aspect, losing approximately a third of the population in aggregate overall, there's also led to this issue of we can no longer trust the very people in whom we had placed our very souls. It also led to a rise in apocalypticism. Here we have already had famine, and now we have plague, and plague is bringing death. And God, we've had wars from Philip IV fighting against England, fighting against Boniface VIII, to John the 22nd fighting against Louis of Bavaria. This is also the time of the so-called 100 Years' War. When I say so-called, because it officially, technically, scholars say it's from approximately 1336, and the first battle to like 1415 or so with the Joan of Arc. But it was even longer than that. France and England have been fighting each other for almost forever, at least since the 12th century and King John. And it's overrun. Now, these were armies, certainly armies fighting armies, but what do armies do when they go through a town? They do what they've always done. They rape, pillage, and plunder. So if you're a village and an army's coming through, it's not nice. War, famine, plague, war, and death. All four signs. The end of the world is coming. It's scary. That wasn't the last of the crises facing Europe in the 14th centuries on into the 15th, but 14th. But before I do, just one final word about the plague. This period, 1347 to 1350, was its most severe. But the plague was not only a pandemic, it was also, I forget what it's called, it kept coming back. I'm sorry, I do know the term, but I just can't think of it. It kept coming back in waves, So there were outbreaks, less virulent successively, but still deadly. Not to the level of 1347 to 1350, but still something to worry about. Luther talks about the plague. He had pastors writing him saying, what do I do? The plague is hitting. Should I flee or should I stay? And he had to address some of those issues. The last outbreak of plague was in 1783, I think it was, or something like that, in Marseille in France, before it finally kind of died out. So in some ways, the focus is usually on this first period of 1347 to 1350, and yet it continued for 400 years to be a factor in Europe. Especially in this early period, it hit as it never hit again. Now, as it was subsiding, momentarily, so to speak, in the grand sweep of things, another massive crisis hit the West. Not again being able to go into all the details, unfortunately. But with the papal princely conflict and Boniface, after Boniface died, the next pope ended up moving from Rome to Avignon. Avignon, was technically not in France, but it was from southern France, certainly in the French realm, north of the Alps. And popes would live in different places. They could do that. And so when Clement um, the Fifth moved to Avignon, it was not that big of a deal. But then John the 22nd not only moved and lived himself in Avignon, he built the papal palace. He moved all of the papal administration to Avignon. So the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon. And that was a crisis. It was a crisis at the time. I mentioned Augustinus of Ancona, who wrote his comprehensive treatment of papal power. He addressed that very question because when he meant comprehensive treatment, he also wanted to say, and this was written for John, look, be careful. No one can judge the Pope. Only God can judge the Pope. Your salvation is at stake if you screw it up. And he asked the question, does the Pope have to live in Rome? And he said, no, the Pope doesn't have to live in Rome. The Pope is the head of the universal church. The Pope can live wherever the Pope wants to live. And yet, the Pope is also the Bishop of Rome. And a bishop not living in his diocese, it's called absenteeism. It had been a problem with bishops all along. I mentioned that bishops were also like princes. If I'm a prince, I'm a nobleman, second or third son, so I'm not going to inherit the duchy from my father. So what I can do, I become a priest and become a bishop. They can work out those kinds of deals pretty easily. So I live a princely life. It's pretty nice, actually. Do I want to say mass? Not really. God, I don't. I have more important things to do. I could care less. Do I want to listen to confessions? Absolutely not. It was always something that was tried to be corrected. That bishops still should be pastors. They shouldn't be princes. They should be pastors. Here we have the problem of it being with regard to the Pope himself, who's an absentee bishop. And Augustinus argued, this goes back to 1326, the Pope can live anywhere, but as Bishop of Rome, he's obligated to live in Rome. It gets very complex in terms of the theory behind it, and the Pope is a univocal concept. It's many different parts of being Pope. But the Pope, as Bishop of Rome, is obligated by necessity to live in Rome, even though the Pope is the head of the Universal Church, can live anywhere he wants. And John, of course, didn't pay much attention to that. He saw the first part of it and said, I know, not paying attention to the second part of it, which Augustinus also wanted to be very clear about. But here we have the Pope in Avignon, an absentee bishop, even if he is still the head of the church, universal. And John, having moved all of the papal administration to Avignon, stayed in Avignon. The papacy stayed in Avignon until 1337. All the while, people throughout Europe, but especially Italians, were clamoring for the Pope to go back to Rome. Well, finally, Gregory IX did. Gregory XI moved back to Rome in 1377. Politically, Rome was a mess. That was one of the reasons and rationales for leaving. It could rule and administer the church far more effectively from Avignon than from Rome because of all the political infighting and conflicts all over the place. When Gregory comes back, he comes back 1377 and dies. So there has to be a new papal election. The cardinals have to get together and elect the new pope. There were a far greater number of cardinals in 1377 than there had been in 1309 or 1310 or even 1330 or whenever. John the 22nd, not only had he moved to Avignon, he himself was French. Jacques de Cahors, before he became Pope. He also expanded the College of Cardinals and filled those new cardinalates, seats, members, with French bishops and French ecclesiastics. So there's a large faction of French cardinals, a smaller faction of Italian cardinals. They get together and elect the Pope. Romans are clamoring that you have to give us a Roman Pope, but if not a Roman, at least an Italian. Well, in that violent mob rioting context, the Cardinals came through and elected the Pope Urban VI. But the French Cardinals had a problem with it. So they said, wait a minute, okay, we elected Urban, but we did so under duress. We were forced to by the rioting crowds. We're going to go back to Avignon and elect the true Pope. That's what they did. They left Rome, went back to Avignon, said, okay, we're going to hold an election to elect the Pope now, outside the duress of the riotous crowds, and we elect Clement VII. So we have Clement being elected by the French cardinals in Avignon. We have Urban in Rome, who's the true Pope. It was difficult. All of a sudden, we have two popes claiming to be popes. And what do? If you're Urban? If you're Urban, you're pissed off. You're saying, what are you guys doing? I was elected pope. I am Christ's vicar on earth, and you have split and elected someone who's not pope, but you're being a schismatic. You're splitting the church. That's heretical, and it has to be condemned. So what am I going to do? I'm going to excommunicate you, which he does. Well, Clement is saying, no, you're wrong. You're not legitimate. I'm the legitimate pope. You're being, belligerent and refusing to recognize that I'm actually the pope. You're being a schismatic. I'm going to excommunicate you. Something about excommunication, which is important to know. If a prince or a king were excommunicated, that meant not only were the individuals excommunicated, but everyone in their realm were. Not in the same way. So if I am King of Bavaria, Duke of Bavaria, King of Bavaria actually comes much later in our period. We'll get to him. Maybe not, but the Duke. If I'm under excommunication, that basically means I'm damned. It's saying that I can receive no sacraments whatsoever. And I'm not in good standing with the church. But that means everyone in my territory, my realm, cannot receive the sacraments. The sacraments are banned. It's under the ban. It doesn't mean that, if I'm Joe Blow and my prince is excommunicated, it doesn't mean that I am under the same type of censure, but I cannot receive the sacraments. My soul's in jeopardy. All of Europe was excommunicated by one pope or the other. Now, that is like, okay, why? Because politically, Europe split too, if you think about it. Any of the Italian city-states, which pope are they going to follow? Urban, of course. The French, which pope are they going to follow? Clement, of course. What about the emperor? He's going to follow Urban, basically. What about the English? English are going to follow Urban because they hate the French. They're going to just follow Urban whether they, really care or not, which is right, but they're not going to follow a French pope. There was political support for both popes sufficiently that neither of them could assert their right. It's called the Great Western Schism. Western because in 1054, going all the way back, the Latin Church in Europe officially split with the Greek Church in Constantinople, even before the Crusades. And there was all kinds of hopes to bring them together ever since. But they officially said, we agree to disagree. There's some serious issues. It's also called the Great Schism. It's the Great Schism of 1054. So this is the Great Western Schism, because this is just with the Latin Church within Christendom, the Latin West, between Urban and Clement. This split continued. Attempts were made to deal with it. They failed. First Council of Pisa in 1409 said, okay, we have to get together and deal with all of this. So we'll get together and we'll elect a new pope, and the other two will resign, and that will be that. The council fathers met in Pisa and they elected another pope. And what happened? Neither the Pope in Avignon nor the Pope in Rome resigned. So now we had three popes, and there was some support enough for this third pope, the Pisan Pope, as it's called, um, that there was some sort of legitimacy there too. Three popes. This is worse than splitting of Christ's tunic, the seamless robe of Christ. The crucifixion, according to tradition, was split. This is a split. It's ripping it apart. What does that mean? We already are not trusting the clergy because of the plague and their complete abandonment of their responsibilities. But now this, look at this mess. Major problems. Major problems. And those continued even after the schism was finally solved, healed. Next council, the Council of Constance, which met in 1414, they finally developed the theory that would allow the council fathers to deal with it. When I say council fathers, I mean the bishops, archbishops, cardinals that are still around, the major theologians at the universities, and princes would send representatives. Princes, kings throughout Europe would send representatives to the council to vote on these matters. What was this theory? It was called conciliarism. And what it said was, and again, this is a very abbreviated explanation, the Pope is not the highest power within Christendom. The council is. And the Pope will serve as a functionary of the council. But the council has ultimate authority. Boniface VIII had asserted the Pope has ultimate authority. Here they're saying the council has ultimate authority, not the Pope. The Pope will work for the council. And they even then issued a decree called Frequens that said, okay, after we're finished here with our business, there'll be another general council of the church in 5 years. And when that's closed, another general council 7 years thereafter, another general council 10 years thereafter, and then every 10 years, there will be a general council of the church just to make sure things are going as they need to be going and should be going. Now, the Council of Constance, they did a number of other things besides settling the schism. They also deal with heresy because they realized there's a real problem here. There was a separatist movement in Bohemia. A master of theology at the University of Prague was developing a huge following within Bohemia, the Kingdom of Bohemia, one of the electors. And at the time of the Council of Constance, actually, the King of Bohemia had become the Emperor Sigismund. What do we do with these people? He's preaching things like the laity should receive the communion of both kinds, and the Pope is not really the head of the church, but the church is greater than the Pope. Well, that's what we've just asserted in our council, but still there's problems with Huss. His name is John Huss. So we at least should bring him to the council to see really what he's saying, because it's what we hear is very worrisome. And they invited him to the council. They said, Master Huss, please come to the council. We'd like to talk to you about your theological views. And he said, no way. I smell, a rat when I hear it, and I'm not going to go. Well, Emperor Sigismund, who had been instrumental in getting Council of Constance together, sorry, and this is going berserk over here. So I'll tell you what, Master Huss, if you come to talk with us at Constance, don't worry, we just want to talk. I will grant you safe conduct to and from the council. Meaning, I will make sure that my troops, the emperor, this is the power of the emperor, will ensure your safety while you travel to Constance to talk with us and when you go back. And given that assurance, Huss said, well, then okay. So Huss goes to Constance. They didn't really have a discussion. Numerous preaching against him, condemning him. They got together. The council fathers did. They held a trial of sorts, and they condemned him as a heretic. Now, obviously, then, once he was a condemned heretic, he had no right to safe conduct by the emperor or anybody else. And what do you do with a heretic? You burn him. So they burned John Huss. This will be important for later on for Luther. They burned Huss. Now, I'm not advocating the burning of heretics. More heretics were burned later than were before. I mean, that just continued. The idea behind it, though, was that heresy can send you to hell. If you don't believe correctly, you're going to go to hell. So it's almost a surgical procedure. And it's better for you, too, actually. They can say, yeah, but people didn't really believe that. They just wanted to go and see somebody, get fried. And yeah, there was that element. But theologically, the idea was a heretic can infect an entire community, just like the phrase, one bad apple can spoil the whole barrel. One rotten apple, you have to get it out of there. That was the idea with heretics. Okay. And there's an element of torture too, hoping that finally the heretic would see his, predominantly his, sometimes hers, but Margaret Porete in 1310 was one of the first burnings of heretics. But with John Huss, it was like, okay, if they confess, then they're saved. And if they refuse to confess and to repent, then they're damned. So if we kind of burn them this trial by fire, maybe at some point they'll say, oh, now I realize I was wrong. Sorry, I confess. Forgive me, God. Oh, and then they die, but then they're saved. Okay? Now, this was a problem because later on we'll see Luther was invited to the Council of Worms, and he expected to have the same fate as Huss. He kind of viewed himself in that tradition. Huss, even, before he dies, before he's burned, says, you know what? You may burn this goose. Huss meant goose in Czech. But a swan is coming whom you will not be able to catch. He prophesied a reformer to come, seeing that there were such problems. In the context of the schism, conciliarism, it's a mess. He was not the only one. It's all in context of the Great Western Schism, and part of why this Reformation failed. So all these attempts, whether it was conciliarism, whether it was the attempt to focus on actually living the Christian life, the new need for penance, and on we go. And there's many other aspects to this and dynamics to it and movements within it in terms of lay piety, reaching out and trying to make everybody a good Christian, and all these other aspects. It didn't bring it all about. It failed. Even though Reformation was consistently called for. 1439 or so, a pamphlet was written, The Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. It was written by an anonymous cleric. We think he was not a member of one of the religious orders, but it was a secular priest. It was at the Council of Basel, which was one of these councils. According to the Council of Constance, it's okay, conciliarism. 5 years. Constance closed in 1418. Next council, also in Pisa, in 1423 opened. It's okay, done, closed, over. 1524 it was done. 7 years, 1431. Council met in Basel. That continued until 38 and 39. And this is where it gets then dicey, because the Pope at this time, Pope soon as Constance, the new Pope Martin V, you don't like to be underneath the council. You start to try to find ways to get your power and authority back. And they had been doing that. And Eugenius IV, Eugenius IV, at Basel was able to do that, to regain the political superiority, to assert his authority over the council. Why? How did he pull that off? Well, a major factor was he had arranged a deal with the patriarch in Constantinople to reunite the Greek Church and the Latin Church that had been separated since 1054, the Great Schism of 1054. Delegates from Constantinople came to Basel, and they discussed and they announced the reunification. Well, some people at the Council of Basel didn't like that. They didn't like Eugenius's asserting his own authority, and there were tensions there. So Eugenius said, "What I'm going to do, I'm going to move this council. Um, First, move it to Ferrara, then he moves it to Florence. And says, "You come and follow me." Again, asserting papal authority over the council, so that the council would have to follow the Pope. And with this reunification proclaimed, most of the council people did. Other people, members of the council, stayed in Basel and said, "Hey, hey, hey, you're going too far. We're going to stay here and do our business," which they did. It ended up being called the Rump Council because what they were doing was seen from Eugenius's point and the people in Florence who had followed Eugenius. You people who are stuck there in Basel, you're trying to cause another schism. We just gotten over the schism. No one wants another schism in the church. That had its effect, combined with the reunification. Like, this is great, Eugenius. Fantastic, you pulled it off. How do you do it? It's a miracle. You are a leader. No one really much followed the so-called Rump Council of Basel, which held on until 1441. Council of Florence, where Eugenius had moved the Council of Basel, closed in 1439. Now, according to the Decree Frequens, established at the Council of Constance, another general council was to have met 10 years thereafter, because that was first the 5 years, then the 7 years, now came the 10 years. So 1439, even taking Boniface's date, or not Boniface, Eugenius's date, closing of the council in 39. One should have met in 49. Did a council meet in 49? No. But what about 10 years after that, 1459? No. 69? No. The next General Council of the Church did not meet until 1512, under very different circumstances. Conciliarism was effectively dead. This idea that the council, as a representative body of the church as a whole, was the ultimate authority, was dead. And papal supremacy was reasserted to the point that in 1462, Pope Pius II issued a papal bull proclaiming conciliarism dead and proclaiming any call to a council over above the authority of the Pope is heretical, and that a council has legitimacy only when called by the Pope. Execrabilis. Papal bulls always begin with the first word or first 2 or 3 words in Latin that they start with. And Pope Pius II, Italian humanist, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, became Pope Pius II. In his bull Execrabilis, it's an execrable, I can't even pronounce that word, execrable heresy and sin to appeal to a council over a pope. That is wrong. That is not going to be allowed. The Pope has supremacy. He reissued and reasserted Unam Sanctum of Boniface VIII. This period from 1414 to 1462, less than 50 years, where conciliarism sort of had a breath, but effectively was dead in 1439. Only 20 years. Over and gone with. Europe was not ready for constitutional government, for representative monarchy. Why? Let me think about it for a moment. It's fine, if you don't really like the Pope, to put him in his place. But the whole theory of government is that a representative body has the highest authority. Whoa, wait a minute. I'm King of France. I'm the Holy Roman Emperor. I'm King of England. I have authority. I'm not subject to the Parliament if I'm King of England. They're there to serve me and to help me, but I can get rid of them if I want. I can listen to them if I want. I can get their help if I want. We can work together, but I'm in charge. Same thing with France. It's not the Estates General. They're not in charge. I'm in charge. I'm supreme. The Emperor, it's not the Reichstag, the Imperial Diet meeting of all the German princes and things. That's not the representative body. It does not have control over me. They might elect me. Okay, fine, but once I'm supreme. I'm not going to go along with this conciliar idea that undermines the very basis of monarchical rule. I may go along with it a little bit. It was effective and helpful to end the schism. Kind of helps keep the Pope in check. But as a theory, I can't really allow this to go on. I can't assert and put my authority behind this because what will my own subjects say? That was some of the conflict. Also, I should point out that the reunification that Eugenius proclaimed and that had been agreed to in Basel and Florence didn't really last because the delegation from Constantinople went back to Constantinople, and the patriarch said, "No way in hell are we going to agree to this?" Because one of the basic premises was, okay, we will recognize the supremacy of the Pope over the universal church. What? You got to be kidding me. No way. So it was dead on arrival until 1453 when Islamic forces overtook and captured Constantinople. It's like, oh, what do we do? Threat from the Turk was still there with early 16th century. Part of that council in 1512 that we got together. Fifth Lateran Council was one of their major problems. What do we do with the threat of the Turk, of Islam coming in? And also all points to the issue of the failed Reformation, because even though there was all these attempts, they didn't actually bring it about. But unless we can see this period from approximately 1300 on into the 16th century as a late medieval Reformation, an attempt, a call to bring it about, we'll lose. In the context of Basel, this anonymous pamphlet that was written, The Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, called for just that, a reformation of society as such. Gave a platform. This is what we need to do. This is how we reform the papacy. This is how we reform the cardinals. This is how we reform the parish clergy. This is how we reform the tax system. This is how we reform the tolls. And all aspects of society were included in what needed reformation. Didn't work. He also proclaimed a coming reformer to come. This was part of this author's vision of Sigismund, who was already dead, but he puts it in the mouth and words of Sigismund. Had a vision from God that a reformer was going to come, a priest king who would be both the priest and the king, and he would enforce reformation from above. Namely, if you don't join him, he's going to shove it down your throat. It will happen. Because why? Both the secular princes and the clergy have completely failed to do their job. A new order is needed. That was what was called for, and that was what was circulated in manuscript and then eventually in print, and being talked about a lot. The second half of the 15th century on into the 16th century. So when I talk about the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, that is what I'm getting at. Now, somewhat abbreviating here because I keep going on, is at this time too, or shortly hereafter, Europe was about to be confronted with the realization that what they had thought the world was actually not. There's a whole new world out there, the age of discovery. There had been long distance trade for quite a while, from the 13th century anyway, within Europe. They knew how to get to China. They knew about spices in the east. They bring spices back. They always went overland. It's a very long, laborious journey. Cost a lot of money. Starting in the early 15th century, Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator, started exploring the coast of Africa. And started finding these other geographical territories. We know Africa. We know it's there in any case, sort of. There's a lot of things there, including gold. Silver was the predominant metal. I mean, gold was extra special. So there were silver mines in Europe, important silver mines, provided wealth for the empire. Um, Martin Luther's father worked in the mining industry. He was a smelter, a Schmeltmeister. I'll talk more about that when we get there. But so the mining and the silver was important, but then gold, of course, was even more valuable. They knew about gold. There wasn't a lot of supply, but in Africa there was the Gold Coast, Ivory Coast, Gold Coast. Well, Columbus also had an idea. His idea was this: the spices that come from the east, they're great market for them, but it's very expensive to go overland all the way to China, all the way to India to bring them back. Now, I've studied my geography. I've studied enough of physics and mathematics, and I'm trained in the liberal arts. I know the Earth is a sphere. And based on my calculations, I'm willing to bet that I can get to the east, to the Spice Islands and China and over there, in India. That's where all the good spices and things are. If I sail west, I can sail west because the globe is a sphere. I will get to the east and I'll get there sooner in less time, in any case, than it would take to go overland. And so, if I can do that more quickly and also more cheaply, our profits will go through the roof. I just need, financing and support. You know, Portugal wasn't really interested. I don't know. We're really developing our exploration of Africa. I'm not sure we're going to go about over to the east. But Spain was interested. Of course, there was no such thing as Spain really at this time, not yet. Spain consisted of three kingdoms. Hispania is one. There's Hispania was the Latin name for the peninsula, the Spanish peninsula. Portugal, Kingdom of Portugal, Kingdom of Castile, and the Kingdom of Aragon. And Aragon and Castile came together, not politically, except by the marriage of their monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. So when they married, when Ferdinand and Isabella married, effectively those two kingdoms came together. Now, they said, Columbus said, okay, well, Portugal, if you're not going to support me, maybe I'll see if Spain will. He was Italian. And so Ferdinand and Isabella said, what the hell, might as well take a chance. And set Columbus sailing. In some ways, we know the rest of the story. He found the New World. He didn't realize he had found a new world, but he found India. He sails, oh my gosh, I've made it. I've made it to India just as I had planned. Oh, and look at these people. I've never seen Indians before, but they're kind of weird looking. But I'll call them Indians. Here are all these Indians. I expected them to look very different from we Europeans. We civilized. They're barbarous people. At first, he didn't really understand that he had found a new continent. And there have been early explorations, we know, with the Vikings going up into Greenland and things. But this whole new continent that was there, it's like, oh my God. And then Columbus came and had a second voyage, and he writes a letter to Ferdinand and Isabella, which is part of your reading for this week, explaining what he thinks the benefits of all this is. And what do we find there? Gold, profit, possibilities for new colonies. It's not an issue of cultural interaction. Let's see what these new people are like. It is purely for profit for Western Europe. In this case, for Aragon and Castile, for Spain, what was becoming Spain. Because gold all of a sudden was a new source of wealth. And this was just the beginning. It's the beginning of colonialization, as Columbus talks about. We can establish colonies. We can go people there, have them there to establish a colony. Just as we're thinking, like, my gosh, if we could establish a colony on Mars, maybe we could. Might be the beginning, might be fearful, but if we could find people winning, that could provide a major source of wealth. That will kill off the Martians because that's ours to take and conquer. From the Western perspective, from the Western European perspective, a colony is something that we get. We can go and get the gold, mine the gold, use the people. They're not really, we don't worry about them too much. And pretty soon, it slowly began to be recognized how important this could be. It took a while. Already in 1493, Portugal and Spain were arguing, wait a minute, because Portugal was saying, we're dividing and we're going after Africa. We don't want you to impose upon. If you're developing, exploration and sailing and long distance trade over the Atlantic, we don't want you getting what we're getting. And Spain said, well, yeah, we want this. So they developed a treaty, negotiations led by the Pope that divided the world between Spain and Portugal, called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And I put a map up of it there in the PowerPoint on two lines. One is 1493 and the other is 1494, because 1493 was the first line that was drawn, and then Portugal said, yeah, but we're not really happy with that. I mean, we just have to get a little bit into this new world. So if you see it moves west, and that 1494 line includes part of what now we call, say, as Brazil, whereas Columbus there in Central America, we call Central America, and Cuba and the eastern coast beginning to be. And that was agreed upon. And the wealth in terms of gold that was coming back, new products, were huge. Also, it had its cost, something called the Columbian Exchange, because Europeans brought diseases to the native peoples, wiped them out. They were not met with peace pipes and, oh, let's sit together and be friendly brothers. It was the violent subjugation of indigenous populations. For European expansion, New World, yes, all European centric. We see it from the other side. These are invaders coming, and they're taking our land, taking our people, they're killing us. It was also this time in the early 16th century then that not only did people bring back gold and other goods, but also people as slaves. Slave trade did not really get going until a little bit later. And this was the origins of this age of discovery and exploration. Africans sold other Africans into slavery. The origins of some of this. It wasn't that the Europeans came and said, oh, we're going to get slaves and grabs people. African tribes are fighting. African tribes are not all the same. It's not like everybody in Africa is all the same, one big happy family, peaceful. They've been fighting for centuries. What do? When you conquer somebody, you sell them into slavery. We know that. You see that in the ancient society with the Hebrew Bible and the Israelites and slavery into Egypt. You conquer people, you send them into slavery. Not that big of a deal. Rome's had slaves. They ran everything on slaves. So if you're a trader coming down and you see people say, hey, you want a bunch of, want some slaves? I can sell you some slaves. Great. Okay, well, give it a shot. And they take them back to Europe. And there's all this speculation of what's going on here. Oh, Ferdinand Isabella, here's gold. And I brought you slaves. Aren't they exotic? Obviously, it would develop. It'll be something we'll be talking about for quite some time. For quite a while, people weren't sure what these slaves were. Were they really human beings? Were they partially human? the 17th century, when the Dutch finally got into the issue of the slave trade, the West Africa Company, they were good Calvinist Dutchmen. I'll explain more about what some of that means in the next lecture. Who were bothered by this because we have the letters, and one of the letters writes back and says, we have a problem because if these people are really human and are fully human, we can't treat them like this because they are creatures of God just as we are. And this would be sinful to treat another creature of God like this. Conflict of conscience. The horrors of slavery were just beginning. That is this context of this late medieval world. Later on, 16th century, Montaigne, though, also wrote an essay on the noble savage, which, wait a minute, these people, they're far better than we are. We may think that they're uncivilized, that they're barbarians, but actually, compared to what we're doing, these people are noble. And our society really sucks. That's heard, read in literary circles. Did it have much of an effect? Not so much at the time, as social critics often never do at the time. But slowly, over time, that's where their impact comes in. So, unrest and anxiety. I'll make this very quickly. With all of this period that we've talked about, the crises involved, the new world opening up, the minds expanding, the world is falling apart. And on top of that, we have peasant revolts and peasant unrest because the peasants were getting the short stick. We have a number of revolts from the later 14th century onto the 16th century of peasants rising up against their lords. And they're not rising up to say, I'm a human being, you need to treat me nicely, or I'm just as equal as you are, or I have rights as individuals. No, what they were saying is, you are not giving us our traditional rights as peasants. You're impinging upon them. Again, I could talk a fair amount about this. There was a crisis of the nobility, the lower nobility especially, being crunched economically. So what they do, they pass that on to the peasantry. So all these things that peasants used to be able to do, like freely collect wood, freely hunt in the forest, freely fish in the streams, those were all being reduced, and then peasants were being charged for that. So all of a sudden added tax for collecting firewood, or an added tax for hunting and fishing, and taxes in general. The tax on the produce that they would work on the land were going up. So the peasants were getting squeezed. We can't even live like this. Peasant unrest. Never very successful. Often forcefully put down. But it's an ongoing issue with all the other issues. Society is not working. And we'll talk about the so-called German Peasants' War next lecture. That was no means a novelty. No means came out of nowhere. It was no means simply a theological discovery and revelation in any way, shape, or form. We'll come back to that. This idea, too, with all this newness and the crises of apocalypticism, that the world is coming to an end, was becoming more and more prevalent. How would you live your life differently if you believed that the world would end on January 2nd, 2022? There have been groups that have been apocalyptic, that have been expecting the end of the world, that haven't pronounced the date and know this date and have prepared for it. We say, oh, yeah, what a bunch of weirdos. Okay, fine. But if you believe that, and the signs were all there, the last days are at hand. We have to get ourselves in order. Because, as the anonymous author of the Reformation, Emperor Sigismund, prophesied, as John Huss prophesied, a reformation would come. We haven't been successful bringing it about, but it would come and will come, and we better be ready. That's the context. This is our point of departure for this course, to look at some of the changes that begin to take place in the 16th century in the continuous context of this late medieval Reformation. Even though it had not been successful, it was there providing the necessary development and precursor attitude to being open to some radical new changes, which were coming in the 16th century, that would begin to shift the operating program of the myth of Christendom towards a new operating program, the myth of the state. That's where we begin next time. Thank you for your patience. And I promise you again, we won't have 3 or 4 parts to a lecture over a few hours from here on out. Thank you.